The Oort Perimeter, Chapter 19. Corbin and Bach stared at a large holographic representation of a Fondo brain and marveled at its complexity. When they said it was highly complex, they weren't just kidding. "I mean, just look at that thing," exclaimed Bach. "Now I see the dilemma that the Fondo have been struggling with all these years," replied Corbin. A moment later, Sarah shimmered into view. Corbin looked up and smiled. "Ah, Miss Sarah, what are you doing here?" he asked. Sarah shrugged. "The Admiral didn't need me for a while, so he thought I might be of some use to you." Corbin nodded towards a holographic AI standing at a nearby terminal, and said, "Thank you, but we already have our own AI helping us." Tails looked curiously at Sarah, and then over at Corbin. He then looked at his other colleagues who gave each other a series of questioning looks before turning their attention back to her. She sensed this curious collection of glances and looked at them in return. A moment later she furrowed her brow. Even though they hadn't said anything, their expressions spoke volumes to her. They knew who she was, and was thus surprised to see her standing there. Realizing this, she shook her head and held her finger to her lips as though to ask them to keep their silence. They looked briefly at each other, and then back at her before nodding in unison. She smiled, and soon turned her attention back to the holographic image. Just then, something piqued her interest. She stepped over to the image as Corbin and Bach were discussing what to do, and studied it with great interest. This soon caught the attention of the two scientists. "Does something interest you, Miss Sarah?" asked Corbin. "Something doesn't seem right about this image. Their brain appears to be all one piece, and yet their medical records say it isn't," said Sarah. Bach shrugged. "It likely is. However, this scanner image may not reflect that, as it is just an initial, low-resolution scan meant to get us started. We plan to do deeper, higher-resolution scans later on when we need the extended data for determining how best to implement the EUTDs. But for the moment, this low-resolution scan will do." Sarah frowned. "You might want to consider doing those now, or you'll get yourself off on the wrong track, which could waste a lot of time, and potentially lead to some unwanted consequences, including unnecessarily risking Fondo lives," she replied. "What makes you say that? Since your scanning resolution is so low, you are working with incomplete data. For example, your scan shows their brain as a single lobe. Yet the Fondo medical records say that their brain is trihemispherical. That alone is dangerous misinformation. And, if that's wrong, there's no telling what else is wrong. Well, as I said, it's merely there to get us started. There's no point spending the time on a high-resolution scan if it's not yet needed," said Corbin. Sarah, however, ignored him and instead waved a hand over the image, before pulling it back towards herself, causing the image to grow several times larger. She then rolled it over to show a white, feathery line of hair-like objects protruding from 2 points on the underside of the holographic brain. Both bundles of hair-like objects, in turn, connected to the center of the image. "This here, I think, explains better why I believe you're wrong starting your work with only a low-level scan. For starters, if you are not aware, their brain contains a neurological substructure similar in design to the corpus callosum of the human brain. The fact that your low-level scans even caught that is surprising. However, this organ, no matter how seemingly insignificant, is highly important. Like the corpus callosum, it connects the 3 parts of their brain together as one. If this little detail were to be overlooked, there is no telling what other, even smaller, and more minuscule, yet highly important things your scans have missed by being so low resolution, a dangerous fact that presents far too much risk to our Fondo allies. That is why I think you need to increase the resolution of your scan, and start over again," she continued. Bach stood wide-eyed at this discovery, and then shook his head in amazement. "Wow, I wish my AIs could think like you do. Half the time we figure stuff out before they do. And they certainly don't present us with such important revelations as this." Corbin pursed his lips in frustration. "Mine have that same deficiency as well. I think it may be wise to push our people to significantly improve our AI's cognitive abilities. Especially since we're relying on them more and more of late to help us with our research. He then looked at Sarah, and said, "Thank you, Miss Sarah. Your assistance is always appreciated." Sarah grinned and fidgeted shyly, being slightly embarrassed at the praise that Bach and Corbin had heaped on her. Just then, Wind Whisper noticed something and pointed a wing at the image. He soon turned to the other 3 fondos and talked quietly with them in chirps, clicks, and chitters. Corbin and Bach both noticed this. "Have you spotted something?" asked Bach. Wind Whisper pointed at the image, and asked, "What does this structure here do?" Bach cocked an eyebrow in surprise. "You don't know?" he asked in disbelief. The 4 fondos shook their heads. "We do not, or else we would not have asked," said Wind Whisper. Well, that makes sense, I guess. Alright then, let's find out what this is. Computer, please isolate and analyze the selected object and try to extrapolate its purpose, said Corbin. The computer immediately set to work and began to analyze the object, taking several minutes to complete its research. Intended use of selected object unknown due to insufficient data, came the disappointing reply. I understand that. But can you determine its use from the data available? Negative, came the flat, soulless reply. Bach grunted. Well, that didn't get us anywhere. Miss Sarah, would you by chance know what this is? Asked Corbin. Sarah rubbed her chin, as though thinking. I don't, but I can try to find out. She reached out and gestured to the image. A moment later flesh and bone appeared around the brain and layer after layer until a complete image of the Fondo body was formed. She then isolated the head and neck area and, motioning to it with her hands, as though parting the Red Sea, she caused the image to change to an exploded view of the Fondo head. In many ways it reminded Corbin of an engineering diagram. Sarah then traced a line with her finger from the small object on the brain all the way out to where the oral nerves connected to a pouch on the surface of the skin. That's the neural connection for the ear, isn't it? Said Bach in surprise. I'd say there's a high probability of that, said Sarah. Bach looked at Corbin curiously. It's interesting that she found that, as that will provide us with a solution to one part of this rather complicated puzzle. How so? Asked Wind Whisper. Well, knowing where the primary oral nerve is allows us a place to connect our inbound data nodes. How is that important? Well, to understand that, you first need to understand how an EUTD works. There are 2 basic data pathways the unit uses during its translation operations. One of which is inbound, and the other outbound. The inbound path provides data from the translator to your brain. The outbound path takes data from your brain, processes it, and then delivers it to the translator, which is then passed to the recipient. While the oral nerve is not the most ideal place to attach an EUTD inbound pathway to, it will, at least, give us a foundation on which to start. Once we know more about how your brain works, we can then create a more advanced integration method similar to what we use, where the pathways themselves are wet-jacked directly into the brain's neural core. But we can't do that right away until we know that doing so won't cause any unwanted harm. But, since we now have this, can't we just take it the next step up and wet-jack it directly into their brains, bypassing the oral nerve and giving them the same thing that we have? Asked Corbin. Sarah shrugged. I think it's best if we get the rider on the horse first and then worry about hitching up the cart later, she said. In other words, we should focus on an incremental design rather than a more aggressive, fully involved one until we better understand their anatomy, said Bach. Correct. Sailor chirped in reply to this. I should most winly agree, he said. We should not cast ourselves from the nest too soon, lest we fail our wings in the attempt. I agree as well, replied Falcon. We should also take the extra step now, and get as detailed a scan as we possibly can, and use that to better develop the necessary interfaces required to give them the best embedded translation devices we can, said Sarah. Corbin and Bach looked at each other quietly for several moments. Honestly, Director, she's got a point. I mean, if we missed something this important due to this low-level scan, what other important things are we missing which might mean life or death, if I understand just how delicate their brains are, said Bach. Corbin pondered this briefly, and nodded. It will set us back a few days. However, it will also ensure that we don't harm them in the process, which would be the worst thing we could do. So let's go for the high-resolution scans, and then focus on an incremental approach to this EUTD project, he replied. Then are we in agreement? Asked Wind Whisper. Corbin smiled. I believe we are. But what about the outbound data path you spoke of? It does not help us if we can only listen, but not speak to others, said Wind Whisper. Well, I think it's like what Ms. Sarah said. Baby steps. Let's make sure we can get the inbound path working first without the risk of breaking anything, and then worry about the outbound path from there, as the inbound path is the easier of the two to implement. So that's where we should start at, and focus our efforts there. The four Fondos looked at each other and talked quietly amongst themselves for several moments before looking back at Bach and Corbin. Very well, then. We will follow your lead, said Falcon with a nod. A tall, slender operations officer stared out the front windows of the bridge, as he sat watch at the engineering station, and sighed in boredom. It's so darn boring out here, he whined. A nearby engineering crewman chuckled slightly as he continued to run numerous deep diagnostics programs on the helm station. Be thankful it is. The quieter, the better, he replied. You engineering types always seem to have something to do. Why should you ever worry about being bored, said the officer. When a ship is running completely to spec, it's difficult to find anything to do. In fact, last I checked, everyone else is in the back either reading, playing cards, or watching movies. I'm up here doing preventative maintenance and fine-tuning on a few of the stations in order to stave off my own boredom, said the crewman. The operations officer sighed. Yeah, sounds like me. I'm so tired of playing cards and everything else, I decided to just sit a couple shifts on the bridge and play with the sensors rather than go stark raving mad with nothing to do. How are you doing that? Asked the crewman. By scanning the area with passive sensors. The crewman looked at him curiously. Is that really a worthwhile expenditure of your time? Or are you just doing that to stave off your boredom? The operations officer shrugged. Well, some of it's because I'm bored, and some of it is real science. The engineer chuckled as he flipped through diagnostic screens. How is what you're doing considered real science? The operations officer grinned, and asked, how many people do you know of who have mapped this entire system before using nothing but passive sensors? The engineer chuckled. None that I'm aware of. Exactly my point. There are so many things you can see with passive sensors that you can't with active ones, so the data I'm collecting should prove quite scientifically useful to the guys back home. If nothing else, it should keep me busy until our tour is done in the next couple of weeks. The engineer then stood up and began gathering his tools. Sounds like a plan to me. Well, I'm heading down to thruster control. Gonna see if there's something I can tune up down there. Let me know if you find anything interesting when you complete your scans. Just then the engineering console chirped. The operations officer leaned forward and looked at it in curiosity. Ah, what do we have here? Something new for a change, he asked. The engineer walked over to him and studied the console. Looks like minor gas movements to me, he said. The officer nodded. They are, but that's not what's so special. Movements like these can signal the presence of something else in the area that we can't see just yet. It could be anything from a piece of dark matter, to he said, his voice trailing off. The engineer perked up in interest. What? What are you seeing? He asked, with a hint of confusion. The operations officer's fingers flitted across the console as he tried to get a better idea of what the sensors were really seeing. I don't know. These sensor readings make no sense. I'm seeing what appears to be a massive energy pressure wave approaching our location. But what's even stranger is that it appears to originate from subspace, which doesn't make any sense, he said. What do you mean? Normally something like this would indicate the presence of a cloaked vessel at high warp. But that can't be what this is. At least not as far as I know. Why not? Because, with a pressure wave this large, whatever is approaching us would have to be absolutely massive. Just then a large Varnock cruiser decloaked just 100 feet off their port bow and gently sailed by, unaware of their presence. The officer swore. He immediately sounded red alert, and then leapt down from the engineering station to his operations post. Moments later the rest of the crew piled onto the bridge. The captain entered last and looked out the front window in surprise. He felt his heart nearly leap out of his chest as he spotted numerous Varnock battleships appearing in the area. "Good gods, where'd they come from?" said the captain. "I don't know, sir, but they're not the only ones. I'm detecting hundreds, possibly thousands of other ships coming in behind them, from frigates to dreadnoughts and everything in between," said the operations officer. "Can you get an idea on them?" "Yes, sir, 1 second," said the operations officer, his voice trailing off. This immediately got the captain's attention. "What? Who is it?" he asked, a clear air of concern in his voice. The operations officer looked over at the captain anxiously, and said, "It's the Varnock Black Fleet, sir." The captain sat down in his command seat and drew up a tactical map. According to what it was showing him, they were currently located just to the immediate right of the main contingent of Mobiac's First Fleet Group. It also showed him that still more ships were coming in behind them by the hundreds. It quickly became clear that Mobiac wasn't sending just a small task force towards Earth. He was bringing with him the entire Black Fleet, all 5,000+ ships. "What do you think they're doing?" asked the tactical officer. "It looks like they're using this system as a rally point to regroup before moving on to their next destination," said the operations officer. "Which would be where?" asked the tactical officer. "I'm not sure, sir, but extrapolating all possible destinations based on their apparent point of origin and assumed current course, the only likely destination in this area is Seoul." A tense nervousness crept over the entire bridge. "So they finally decided to stop talking and start shooting, said the captain. "Looks that way, sir, which means, if they're heading towards Seoul, the fleet isn't a lot of trouble. If we don't warn them, they might not stand a chance of surviving this attack," said the tactical officer. The captain sighed. "Our fleet doesn't stand much of a chance against a battle group that large anyways, even with ample warning. But, at least a little heads-up might give them the time they need to retreat behind the Oort Perimeter and wait there for the Gaec Vaughn to show up and rescue them. Helm, set course for Seoul, maximum FTL. Operations, prepare an encoded burst message for Compson. We'll only have a few seconds to deliver it as we pass by." "Aye, sir," came the replies. Alfred looked up from his desk as his door alarm chimed. "Come." The door swished open and one of the duty officers strode in. "Sir, we've received a Priority 1 message from the scout ship Longbow. They report that the Varnock Black Fleet is on its way here. On top of that, Operations is reporting that all subspace communications in and out of Seoul are currently being jammed." Alfred stood up in shock. "When did this start?" "About 5 minutes ago, sir." "Put all fleets on combat alert, and notify the Grand Admiral." "Aye, sir," said the officer. He then turned and hurried back to the main command center. Alfred, in turn, brought up the latest long-range sensor readings on a display screen next to him. They weren't seeing anything yet, but that didn't mean that the Varnock weren't coming. He dismissed the screen, and then hurried down to the command center. Mike trotted quickly down the main hallway of the officer's quarters as he struggled to put his jacket on. "Why do bad things always happen in the middle of the night?" he muttered. Sarah floated down the hallway next to him as he ran. "Would you like me to summon the crew?" she asked. "Not just yet. I want to see if this is the real thing, or just a false alarm." "False alarm? How could a sighting of the Varnock Black Fleet a few light years from Seoul be considered a false alarm?" she asked. "Stranger things have happened. Besides, how do we know this isn't something completely innocent? After all, nobody really keeps us up to date on the latest political and military activities happening in the galaxy anyways. They seem to think we'd do something bad with it if they did. So something like this is not all that unexpected." He soon stepped into a nearby elevator and said, "Command Central." The door swished shut and the elevator immediately accelerated upwards like a shot. After a few seconds, it stopped, turned, and then proceeded forward for a ways before stopping and opening its doors. Mike stepped out into the command center and surveyed the bustle of activity around him. Not far away, Alfred stood in the Eagle's Nest, a small, circular command platform in the middle of the room, and directed all operations from there. Mike trotted across the room to him. "What's our status?" he asked. "So far, we've got nothing, sir. The only thing we know is that all subspace communications in this sector have been jammed. The good news, however, is that none of our hyperband fleet channels are affected. It's likely because they haven't figured out how to jam hyperband yet, or even detect it for that matter, which is one small miracle we should be thankful for." "Have the Gaekvan been notified?" "Not yet, but they will be. The scout ship Longbow made note in their transmission that they'd be continuing on and would try to reach the nearest Gaekvan military hub as soon as possible and inform them of our plight. But, given the certainty of political meddling, finger-pointing, threats and denial, it could be the better part of a day or more before we can expect any kind of assistance from them." "Sounds about right. So, in other words, we're on our own for most of this fight. Unless a miracle happens, that's more or less where we're at." Mike frowned. "Well, believe me, I'll be praying for that miracle. In the meantime, we need to feign dumb, and allow them to think they've caught us off guard. Make sure all fleet ships and defensive stations stay on alert, but have them move to a stand-down posture. Make it look like we're unaware of their approach. Also, monitor all traffic in and out of Gate 27, through the Commerce Channel, and around Pluto Station. I don't want them sneaking a Trojan horse inside our perimeter while we're not looking. What if it's already here? Then we'll need to find and neutralize it. Increase the number of patrols around that area and tell them to watch for any suspicious activity, then close all gates on the Kuiper perimeter. If one's already inside the Oort perimeter, I don't want to risk their getting through to Earth and possibly committing a sneak attack from behind." Alfred nodded. "Already handled. We locked everything down the moment we heard the news, just to be on the safe side." Mike blinked in surprise. "Really?" Alfred grinned. "I've known you for long enough, Admiral, that I can pretty much guess what you're going to say long before you say it." Mike furrowed his brow and smiled. "I'm that predictable, am I?" Alfred shrugged. "Only on the procedural level. Tactically, you're one of the best commanders I know. Even I can't outguess what you're going to do in combat." Mike laughed. "Well, that's at least partially reassuring. But, either way, if all those things are done, then the only thing left now is to wait and see what the Varnock do, if anything. Speaking of which, do we know which armada this is?" "We do. It's the Black Fleet." Mike blinked in surprise. "The Black Fleet? Wow, they're not playing around, are they? Do we have any information on them or their commander?" Alfred shook his head. "Sadly, no. All we know is that he's been decorated several times for exemplary command and tactics. The rest is a big mystery." Mike pursed his lips. "So we're going up against an enemy we really know nothing about, who's commanding one of the best equipped, most experienced, and most decorated battle groups in the entire Varnock fleet. Yeah, this isn't gonna end well." Alfred rolled his eyes. "I've been thinking that as well." Mike inhaled deeply, and said, "Well, even if the odds are stacked against us, I don't plan on just rolling over for them. If they want Earth, they'd better be ready to pay dearly for it, because we're not going down without a fight." Alfred nodded. "Agreed, sir. Death before surrender, as always." "All stop," said Mobiek. "Answering all stop, my lord," came the reply. Mobiek stared at the main display at the front of the bridge as he studied the massive shield grid that stood before him. "Any sign that they've detected us?" he asked. "No, my lord," said a nearby officer. "Is the information given to us by the Juna accurate?" he asked. "Everything checks out so far, my lord." Mobiek glared at the officer. "So far?" he asked with a menacing hiss. "There is a lot of information here, my lord. Not all of it can be verified immediately. But what can be checks out, said the officer with a hint of fear. Mobiit growled lightly as he flared his gills in disgust. Then let the attack begin. We do not leave until every Chapachi is dead, he said. Yes, my lord. Mike perked up as alarms began sounding all over the command center. Sir, a massive Varnock battle group is decloaking just outside of Gate 27. Ships are powering weapons and preparing to fire, shouted one of the officers. Well, I guess that confirms that this isn't a false alarm, said Mike. All ships and stations, red alert. All units switch to active combat mode. Stand by to defend Seoul, shouted Alfred. Within moments the command center came alive, as orders were given and preparations for the initial attack made. Alfred, I'm going to take the Sir Genius out and lead the fleet in the field. You be my eyes and ears here while I try to hold back the attack, said Mike. But, sir, you can't do that. You're needed here, cried Alfred. You know I can't command from a distance. I need to be in the thick of it. Don't worry, I've got the best ship and crew in the fleet behind me. Just hold down the fort for me, and God willing, we'll win this fight. Alfred hesitated for a moment, and then said, Godspeed to you, sir. Mike nodded, and then turned to Sarah, and said, prep the ship and call the crew. Sarah smiled. Already done. They're waiting for you in the launch bay. Mike grimaced as he blinked in surprise. Good grief, woman. You've got to stop reading my mind like that. You're getting as bad as Alfred, he said. Pendleton stared curiously at Mike as he plopped down in his chair. What's your orders, sir? He asked. Take us out to Oort Perimeter Gate 27, best possible speed, said Mike. Aye, sir, replied Pendleton. He then turned and quickly piloted the ship out of space dock as numerous other ship killers, fighters and light assault ships began deploying into the space around Earth. As they accelerated away at top speed, Pendleton plotted a course through the Kuiper perimeter, and then out to Gate 27. Sir, Admiral Boffenheiser is hailing you, said Martin. Patch it through, said Mike. Aye, sir. A holographic data display appeared in front of Mike on which was a picture of Alfred, Corbin, and Bentley. Yes, Alfred, what you got? The Varnock fleet has begun bombarding the shield. I called in Dr. Corbin and Mr. Bentley to be our advisors since they have the most experience with this new shield system. I've also dispatched 2 ships, the London and the Ontario, to your position. They'll be flying as your escorts. Thanks. We'll be watching for them. Dr. Corbin, what can you tell me about the status of the shield? Will it hold? Corbin nodded. So far the shield is handling everything the Varnock are throwing at it with little trouble. However, we've begun detecting some strange oscillations in the shield array we've never seen before. Normally I would be concerned. However, I suspect those are simply byproducts of the bombardment, and thus nothing of concern. Are they any risk to the shield? Corbin shook his head. Not that we can tell. But we'll be keeping a close eye on it just in case. All right, keep me informed of any issues that might arise. Will do. The image flickered for a moment, and then was replaced by a tactical overlay of the entire defense area. All right, let's reassign some ships and get ourselves ready in case they break through, said Mike. You actually think they will? Asked Eric. No, but I'm not going to just sit by and expect everything to be all unicorns and rainbows either. Should something happen, and the shields do get breached, we need to be ready to fend them off at a moment's notice. Aye, sir. Sarah stood on top of the upper main ball turret of the Sir Genius and watched as the ship glided to a stop at the rear of a vast formation of starships ranging from small, swift fighters and ship killers, to big and lumbering, but powerful destroyers, battlecruisers and rugged, indomitable dreadnoughts. Off in the distance sparkled thousands upon thousands of little blue and green lights, like 100,000 fireworks all exploding at once in a constant display of beauty and grandeur. but it was a beauty that belied the brutal lethality that lay just beyond as round after round of cannon and torpedo fire impacted the Oort Perimeter shield array in a steady rain of death. No matter how long she'd lived, it always amazed her how brutal and cruel living creatures could be to each other at times, and yet so kind at others. She thought about the Varnock that now faced down Earthfleet, and then about Mike. It was true that she was there merely as a scientific observer, and yet she couldn't take her mind off the fact that Mike was now in mortal danger. She shook her head. No, she couldn't interfere in the lives of her observational subjects. Yet she had. Being in the position she was, she'd already broken that simple precept of impartial scientific observation many times over. But, at the same time, she wasn't angry about it. The things she'd learned by getting close to this small group of humans, and most especially to Mike, had proven invaluable to her. Yet, there was something else there. A feeling, a concern, a desire to protect him above all the others. This was new to her, something she'd never experienced before in all her centuries as a researcher, and yet she didn't feel as though she'd been wrong in pursuing it. The thought intrigued her, and in some ways scared her as well. It was a wise scientific practice to remain aloof and detached from one's observational subjects. But, by having instead become personally involved with them, it had provided her with a unique insight into their lives that she wouldn't have gained in any other way. She looked up as more ships jumped into the battle area and began taking up positions in the formation around her. It was clearly time to go back inside and see to Mike's needs. But, just as she turned to leave, a sensation rippled across her mind. She paused and stared out towards the Varnock fleet. She probed deeper, but found that the feeling was now gone. Her eyes narrowed as she contemplated what she'd just sensed. It was another, like herself, but familiar. She'd felt it only for a fleeting moment, but it had been enough to catch her interest. She wondered if Zoan had returned. If he had, and he was meddling in this battle, he'd have her wrath to deal with in ways he'd never seen before. She reached out with her mind for several moments longer, and sensing nothing else, returned inside the ship.